This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast though, well, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, behind the scenes stories, just bits and bobs really that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not really to do snark either. Instead, the podcast, if anything, is here to celebrate the fact that it's really hard to make a film, and applause to the people who managed to do it, yet alone films that go on to become festive favourites, as we're going to talk about in this particular episode. This particular episode, well, the two movies I've chosen are festive ones. This is being recorded and released just before Christmas 2020, and so what I've done is I've picked a well-known Christmas movie, a less well-known Christmas movie, and I'm going to dig into the stories of both of them. Let's start with one of the biggest though. Let's go back to 1990. I'll play you a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
I took a shower washing every body part with Astral soap, including all my major crevices, including in between my toes and in my belly button, which I never did before but sort of enjoyed. I washed my hair with the Don't Formula shampoo and used cream rinse for that Just Wash shine. I can't seem to find my toothbrush, so I'll pick one up when I go out today. Other than that, I'm in good shape.
That certainly woke me up. It's a clip from Home Alone from 1990, of course, directed by Chris Columbus, written by John Hughes, starring Macaulay Culkin, Joe Pesci, Daniel Stern. John heard the wonderful Catherine O'Hara, and a cameo in the midst there from John Candy as well as an early performance of Kieran Culkin too. The story of this one though, well, it started in two different places really. First of all, there was the making of 1989's film Uncle Buck, starring John Candy, written and directed by John Hughes. I've covered that in a previous episode of this podcast. And in that particular movie, well, there was a young boy cast by the name of Macaulay Culkin. You might have heard of him. But specifically, there's a sequence in that film where Culkin's youngster has a conversation with a babysitter through the letterbox of his home. And it was that image of the chat through the letterbox that sparked something in John Hughes' head, and that in part led to the genesis of what would be Home Alone. Because what he would also do, well, Hughes would mix that with an experience he'd had in the past as well. And as he would tell Time magazine, it sprang from a small domestic problem. I was going away on vacation, he said, and making a list of everything I didn't want to forget. I thought, well, I better not forget my kids. Then I thought, what if I left my 10-year-old son at home? What would he do? Now, Hughes, a proficient writer at the best of times, as I've discussed many times, he was still in the midst of making Uncle Buck, but he started writing, he started putting some notes down, and then, well, those notes quickly developed. Now, Hughes, notorious for turning around first drafts of screenplays very, very, very quickly. He told Time that he'd written 8 pages of notes that developed into the screenplay of Home Alone. The first draft of that particular particular script it took him under 10 days to do. Now, this is talked about quite a lot when we discuss John Hughes movies, that he writes this script in a week or whatever. It does overlook the fact that then he goes back, he went back and he reworked the vast bulk of the scripts that he was involved in. But nonetheless, he was set up with a deal at Universal Pictures where he'd made Uncle Buck. He wasn't happy there. He was looking to come out of that deal, but also part and parcel of what the Universal deal he had allowed was he was able to make films and offer films somewhere else. So that's going to be important. I'll come to that shortly. Because Hughes was busy. I mean, he wrote far more films than he could ever direct. And in the case of this one, he was doing some work with Warner Brothers. Now, separately, Chris Columbus was a director. Well, at first, he was a writer. He was known for Gremlins and The Goonies, but he got his own break into directing with, well, a pair of movies. There was 1987's Adventures in Babysitting, his directorial debut, and that did quite well. A film that didn't do quite well was the film he made the year after, Heartbreak Hotel, came out in 1988. He wrote that one as well. It starred David Keith as Elvis Presley, and it just came and went with a bit of a whimper. So Columbus was at that point, he was looking for work, and Hughes approached him with, well, the director's chair for National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation that Hughes was also working on. So Columbus was, yeah, I'll do that, signed up to do the movie, but that didn't go very well at all. And as Columbus would say in an interview with Insider, it was working with Chevy Chase on National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation that led to him walking away from the project. That he wasn't career-wise in a position where he could walk away from the film, but conversely, as a human being, he didn't want to work with Chevy Chase and knew he had to get out. So he did what he couldn't afford to do, and he quit the movie. Jeremiah Chechik would take that film on. That's a whole story for another time. Now, 2 weeks after quitting National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, he got a phone call off John Hughes. And in this case, Hughes sent him 2 different scripts to choose from for directing. One was a film called Reach the Rock that ultimately got made, but not for many, many years later, and would pretty much disappear. The other was Home Alone. Now, he was not the only director to get these 2 scripts. A director by the name of Patrick Reed Johnson also got sent them. Reed Johnson turned them down, though. However, when it came to Home Alone, Hughes now had his director, Chris Columbus, signed up to make the movie. Now, Columbus, with a background as a writer, he would have further input into the screenplay. As he would tell Entertainment Weekly a few years ago, he made changes towards the end of the film. I'm going very, very spoiler light, just to give it a bit more payoff in there. But while Columbus was working on the screenplay, John Hughes was trying to work out, well, who's going to back the film? So Hughes had worked with Universal and had worked with Paramount in the second half of the 1980s, and it would be fair to say neither was in a rush to work with him again. That whilst you got the upside of working with him, some memorable films, and certainly looking back, some extremely memorable films, he was notoriously high maintenance and a very difficult man to work with. Now, at this stage, it was Warner Brothers, who he'd been making Christmas Vacation with, who was all set up to make Home Alone. I think this is a pretty famous story. Now, Hughes had assured Warner Brothers this was going to be around $10 million to make, but it was a hugely challenging movie. Bit of a jigsaw puzzle just by the sheer physical complexity of what Hughes had put in his script. An awful lot of physical comedy, and it was looking at quite a long production cycle as well. Hughes had feared that Warner Brothers would penny pinch if it went over that 10 million. That it basically would not stump up for any overages and pressure Hughes to bring the film down. So on the quiet, behind Warner Brothers' back, he went and sounded out 20th Century Fox to see if Fox wanted to back the movie, and there he had a lot more luck. And so basically this is the story of how Warner Brothers lost one of the highest grossing family movies of all time, certainly at the time, and it was over in the end $8 million that Fox agreed to pay more for the film than Warner Brothers. Fox would put in a budget ultimately of 18 million, and the movie was going ahead just with a different studio behind it, and it would kickstart an ongoing relationship between John Hughes and 20th Century Fox that I'm coming to a little bit later. Now, even though the role of Kevin McAllister in Home Alone was pretty much always earmarked for Macaulay Culkin in John Hughes's mind, one of the things that Hughes never really got an awful lot of credit for was how much he was willing to cede to his directors. That Patrick Reed Johnson, for instance, when they were making Dennis, he was quite nervous about going back to Hughes with changes for the script because Hughes cut quite an intimidating figure with that sheer backlog of movies to his name, and it was Hughes in the end who pushed him to just say, no, let's go over that screenplay and let's work it out. Now, Columbus had already been doing that with the Home Alone script, but also what Hughes wasn't going to do was mandate the casting of Home Alone. He appreciated the fact that he was not directing the film. So over 100 young actors were seen for the role, but ultimately it was Culkin who clearly landed it. And Columbus would talk about this in The Guardian in an interview in 2013 over the casting of Culkin, and he talked about how he was much younger as a filmmaker then, and he was really too naive to think about the family environment as well. We didn't know that much about the family, the broader Culkin family, at the beginning. As we were shooting, we learned a little more. The stories are hair-raising. I was casting a kid who truly had a troubled family life, and so Columbus went on to cast the first Harry Potter film. He directed the first two Harry Potter films, of course, and he said, I realised that you have to cast the family as well. And this goes back to the fact that Culkin's father, Kit, was infamous really for throwing his weight around, really. When it came to making Home Alone 2, it was Kit Culkin who made Macaulay Culkin part of a film called The Good Son, and there's a whole story and a half there. But he was a very hands-on manager of his son, and not to the benefit of his son, according to some. Now, I wasn't in the midst of that, but the reports are out there for you to read, and they pretty much make your eyes water. Culkin did have a lot of fun on set, and there was no implication in what Columbus was saying about a problem with Culkin himself, more the issues with his family around him. When it came to the role of the two burglars in the movie, pivotal to Home Alone, the Wet Bandits. So you've got these two characters, Harry and Marv, and initially Robert De Niro and John Lovitz were amongst those sounded out for the role of Harry. Both would pass on the movie, and it took a little while before Joe Pesci's name bubbled to the top. So people like Rowan Atkinson were linked in there. Bob Hoskins, his name came up. Jeremy Irons, he was on the shortlist to play one of the Wet Bandits as well. Others, there's a long list that it's quite hard to check online as to possible people who were involved. Phil Collins, for instance, I saw his name listed. I went through his memoir, it's not listed in there. Christopher Lloyd, Gene Hackman, one rumour even suggested Warren Beatty, but I can't see an awful lot of evidence of those. What there is evidence for is Chris Columbus's reverence, really, to Joe Pesci from his work in films like Raging Bull. But again, quite an intimidating figure, perhaps, to bring onto the set of a family movie, that Joe Pesci isn't really someone you think of as a family film performer. Nonetheless, he was the person who Columbus really wanted for the role, and ultimately he landed the part. Now, when it came to the role of Marv, well, Daniel Stern came to the top of the list fairly quickly, but there was an issue there, and that was initially they wanted Daniel Stern on set for 6 weeks. They wanted 6 weeks of his time to make Home Alone, but then after they'd agreed that with the actor, they realised they needed him for a couple of weeks longer, that at the very least this was going to be 8 weeks of his time, and off the back of that, he backed out of the movie. In then came an actor by the name of Daniel Roebuck to take on the role. By this point, Joe Pesci had been cast, but there was a real feeling, before any footage was shot, that there was something missing there. There was a chemistry between Pesci and Roebuck, just couldn't match the chemistry between Pesci and Daniel Stern. And ultimately, Roebuck would be paid off. He would get a fat check for not appearing in the film, but reportedly wasn't best happy about the whole process. Nonetheless, Daniel Stern came back in, and the cast of Home Alone then came together from that point onwards relatively quickly. Now, against this backdrop of the casting of the movie, I mean, things were motoring really, really quickly. Again, not uncommon with John Hughes productions, in that from script to start of filming, I put it about a year, if that. But in the midst of it all, there was an awful lot of pre-production work that was having to be done, because it goes back to the physicality of what they were trying to do. That, again, this was an era where they couldn't rely on CG, and the stunt work was going to have to be done, well, on the set of the film and in camera. And it was stunt work that oftentimes involved a 10-year-old central character who ultimately had a stunt double who was, let's just say, a lot older. But it was the booby traps, really, that are much loved in Home Alone, that were taking an awful lot of time to get right. And stunt tests were underway while the casting was being done. The stunt test would continue into production, but that production alone, that was going to be tricky as well. So filming started on Home Alone on February the 14th, 1990. In common with the vast majority of John Hughes movies, this one shot in and around the Chicago area. It was going to involve 4 months of physical production for this movie. An awful lot of filming for an $18 million movie. Now, there were little bits and bobs around the side of it that weren't necessarily on the as expensive. So, for instance, the Angels with Filthy Souls movie that you see in the film, well, that was shot very clearly. That was shot particularly for the film. It would cause problems for Columbus when he came to make the sequel, in that he had to match the style of everything. So he found that quite challenging, and the whole idea of making it look like an old flick. But the rest of it, well, off they went to Chicago. Now, the exterior and some interior work was done at a house in Illinois, in the Winnetka area. And unusually for this one, it was a family home that they rented to shoot the film in, and the family didn't fully move out. And so they came up with a mix of various different ways to do this. So there were some sound stages that were used for interior sequences. For the basement of the McAllister's home in Home Alone, they actually went to a local school and used its swimming pool, because then they would be able to flood it. And so they turned that into the basement of the house. They used rudimentary physical effects to do the boiler in the house as well. That any plans they had to do anything more sophisticated just had to be a little dialed down. Finding the house itself had been a challenge. It was the key challenge, really, for the location scouts on the movie, because, again, just down to the precision of the physical moments that had been written. It demanded there needed to be a treehouse in the garden. It demanded that there needed to be certain elements of the house in certain places for sequences to work. And it had taken several weeks to find this house, and in the end, the location scouts in Columbus, they sent the picture of the one they found and were recommended to John Hughes, who instantly pretty much said, yes, that's actually pretty much what I was expecting and what I was thinking of when I was writing the movie. One key thing too is during the shoot, well, this was a family neighbourhood that they were shooting on, and having even a low budget movie was going to be disruptive. So they sought and got permission from neighbours to shoot in and around the area as well. Well, most of the neighbours, because as Chris Columbus would remember to Entertainment Weekly, he said people were extremely cooperative. But then I think they were starting to get a little annoyed with us, because it was a low budget movie and we couldn't afford to build the exterior of the house on a soundstage. So all of those stunts that happened outside of the house happened at night, and we would be shooting from like 5:30 at night to 6 in the morning. Imagine that next door. What fun. And there were obviously the big lights associated with filming. There were actors shooting. There was a director with a megaphone shouting action, and some of the neighbours reportedly were less enamoured with the idea of having this production on their doorstep. There was also the complexity of the fact that at the heart of the movie was a child actor, and there are different rules demanding how much work a child actor can do during 24 hours of shooting. So, for instance, Macaulay Culkin couldn't shoot at night. They only were able to work with him for a few hours, and so they had to shoot Culkin's material during the day, and then when it came to the night shoots, that's when they could bring in Daniel Stern and Joe Pesci, and Chris Columbus would have to voice Kevin McAllister off camera, and it would take quite a lot of knitting together in the editing room to pull those sequences together. What would also take an awful lot of effort and work was pulling the stunts together. And Columbus has talked about this a few times in interviews over the years. And he talks, I mean, going back to that Entertainment Weekly piece, he said every time the stunt guys did one of those stunts, it wasn't funny. We'd watch it and I would just pray that the guys were alive, and then they'd get up and they were absolutely fine. And only then would they watch the playback on the video and were relaxed enough to laugh. And these weren't the kind of stunts he'd put on film before. These were hugely demanding ones. And they left most of the physical stunt work until the end of the shoot, because they were still building the stunt sequences while production was ongoing. As I said before, they were still working out the best way to do them. But what Columbus also noted, that even though they'd waited that long to do them, there's always still an unknown quantity to doing stunt work, that anything can potentially go wrong. And so what they did is they tested a lot of the stunts in the school gymnasium that they'd, as part of the school they'd hired, and they used lots of foam pads and safety harnesses and bits and bobs, that when it came to the actual shoot, they weren't going to be able to use all of that safety equipment. And he said, now if you were shooting that sequence now you'd have to have safety harnesses, etc. on, but as Columbus said, there would be a lack of reality about the stunts in a weird way, because the harnesses make people move differently. These guys just really did the stunts. Now, one of the more bittersweet stories about Home Alone is the appearance of the brilliant late John Candy in the movie, who had one day on total in set to shoot his memorable cameo. And I've written about this on the Film Stories website, but John Hughes and John Candy were firm friends for a long time. And Hughes offered him, as part of the deal to appear in a cameo in Home Alone, just a tiny percentage of the gross box office. But John Candy declined this offer. He saw that he and Hughes were friends, and he saw he was doing more of a favour to John Hughes, and he didn't want to take that slice of money away from him. He thought that they'd go on and do a lot more movies together. As it happened, I'll come to this at the end, they didn't really. They did a couple. But nonetheless, that was all to come, because when it actually came to the shooting, he turned up with and was basically told, you're going to improvise your role in this. You and the band that you're working with are going to improvise it all. And Candy ultimately would be paid $414 a day rate, basically, for appearing in the film. And as Columbus said, John literally filmed his scenes in Home Alone in less than 24 hours. I mean, this is picked up in the book Searching for Candy by Tracy Morgan. And that book describes how a driver was waiting in the car park ready to take John Candy to the next job that he had to get to. And so the band that you see in there, the Kenosha Kickers, were actually they were available in large part because they were local. They were working in the Illinois area, and so they were able to come along just for that little bit of the shoot. Candy wasn't the only one who was able to improvise. I mean, John Hughes sets anyway were hugely encouraging of improvisation, and even though this was a Chris Columbus set, the actors were given space to do that, right down to Culkin. He improvised lines in there. Daniel Stern improvised lines. The story goes that Stern and Pesci heightened their performances as the Wet Bandits because they didn't really think it was going to be a big film. They didn't think much was going to come of it, so they figured they might as well have some fun with it, which is pretty much what they did. One person who said not to have enjoyed the making of it was John Hurd. He was reportedly someone who wasn't keen on the movie and was a little bit downbeat of it, to the point that he would do an about turn when it came to the sequel and would apologise on camera for Chris Columbus's benefit and said he got it wrong, and Columbus said he still has the footage of that one. The film wrapped up after its exhausting shoot, and Columbus has talked about just how hard these two films were, the two Home Alone films were for him to make, in the middle of May 1990, and it was then a case of a lot of footage to work through to come up with the final cut of the movie. But also there were challenges coming up as well, in particular on the scoring of the movie, that Bruce Broughton, the composer, had worked with Chris Columbus Columbus previously on his films. And when the initial publicity was issued for Home Alone, the first poster, Bruce Broughton's name was on it as the person doing the music for it. Nonetheless, that didn't come to pass because Broughton was on deadline for a Disney movie he was working on. Remember The Rescuers Down Under? Well, that's the film that he was in the midst of doing the music for, and as a consequence, he couldn't anymore fit in Home Alone. What could they possibly do? And it was a favour really through Steven Spielberg that got John Williams interested, that he was sounded out on the production's behalf, and a full print of the film was sent to John Williams, obviously without the music at that point. Williams screened it and really got charmed by the film, and he agreed to score the movie. And I do want to stop and say that I think the score to Home Alone is absolutely superb, and I don't say it lightly in the catalogue of John Williams' wonderful work. I just think it's up there with some of his best material, this and the sequel. I think it's really, really strong stuff. It was also a tough edit to do just because, I mean, there are stories, or you don't have to look far for stories of the many deleted scenes in Home Alone and the sequences that didn't make the final cut. I think there's an awful lot of that out there. And as a consequence, I mean, it was just a case of homing it down and homing it down and homing it down. But as the film approached its release date, there was still the matter really of expectations, because it's easy to say now, but nobody saw this coming, that the premiere was set for Illinois on the 10th of November 1990, with a US release set to follow on the 16th of November 1990. We get it in the UK 7th of December 1990. But, the expectation from 20th Century Fox, well, it was going to be happy if this one brought in $40 million at the box office. It would have a tidy profit. Everyone could move on to the next projects. It was already working with Hughes on what the next films were going to be. And as long as this one could turn a nice return, well, Fox were going to be happy. Certainly the first raft of reviews didn't do an awful lot to convince people they had a monster hit on their hands. It was pretty mixed bag of reviews that came out. And also the competition that first weekend that Home Alone hit cinemas. In America, it opened up against Rocky V, and big things were expected of that. It opened against The Rescuers Down Under. Certainly big things were expected of that as well. The number one film the week before had been Child's Play 2. Perhaps less expected of that one, but nonetheless, it was coming in a busy schedule where the likes of Ghost was still hanging around. Reversal of Fortune was building up ahead of steam. Memphis Belle was still in the charts, number 11 in the charts the weekend that Home Alone came out. But Fox's, I'd like to say reduced confidence, but caution with the movie. It only released the film in the US on 1,202 screens. And to put that in context, that Rocky V was going out on 2,053 screens. Now, one of the upsides of that, a real significant upside of that, was it led to early screenings of the film selling out. And the word of mouth in these pre-internet times quickly built up, because it also meant that those who did get in to see the film were getting in to see it generally with a packed house, and a packed house watching a comedy, well, it was going down a storm. The word of mouth spread, but for the first week it was a real struggle to find a cinema that was showing it, that had space, that hadn't sold all of its tickets. And it's telling that the week after, Fox just gradually upped the screen count to 1,284. The week after, it was up to 1,342. It took 3-4 weeks before it was up to 1,764, and then heading into Christmas it finally crossed 2,000 cinemas. And the word of mouth had built to a point where the film, well, it had become a genuine flat-out phenomenon, to the point where it made 20th Century Fox's Christmas, but it didn't really help anyone else's. That the growth and the grosses of Home Alone would notably take box office away from lots of films that were coming out in the weeks afterwards that thought they had a much clearer run. So if you look at the family movies that were suddenly found themselves up against this film, well, Three Men and a Little Lady came out the week after. The Rescuers Down Under struggled against it. Three Men and a Little Lady, that struggled against it. Even bigger films. I mean, Clint Eastwood in The Rookie, that kind of got lost. Look Who's Talking 2 came out when Home Alone had been in cinemas for 5 weeks. Got nowhere, really. Kindergarten Cop, that came out, and its box office was below expectations too. And it was put down in large part to the Home Alone effect. I mean, William Goldman wrote about this in one of his books, about this process really being described as being Home Alone, when you've got a film out, a film that seems to be working, but its box office has just been completely dwarfed by another film that nobody saw coming. As a consequence of the huge success of the film, and it did a metric ton as well on video too. Remember video? I remember video. Fox quickly wanted a sequel to this one, and quickly wanted to get back into the John Hughes business. That in fact, the next Hughes project, Only the Lonely, that Chris Columbus also directed, by the time that arrived in cinemas, Home Alone was still just about still around. It was around for that long. The push, though, was to do Home Alone 2, which I've covered previously in the Film Stories podcast, and that would be turned around within 2 years. John Candy sadly wouldn't return for that one, and he and John Hughes were really starting to drift at that point. That he'd starred in Only the Lonely, but he was the pair of them by the time of Candy's premature death were just no longer the firm friends that they were before, and this would firmly rock Hughes when Candy did lose his life. And it's said to be one of the reasons why Hughes gradually took more and more of a backseat from filmmaking. I mean, by the time Home Alone 3 came round, much later down the line, I mean, most of the personnel had moved on. There had been a request to do by Chris Columbus to do Home Alone 2 and 3 back to back, to take advantage of the fact that Macaulay Culkin would only be this age right now, and this was their moment. But 20th Century Fox was reluctant to do so. One consequence, though, is Warner Brothers was keen to atone for its mistake in passing on Home Alone, and it agreed to back the film Dennis, based on the American Dennis the Menace, not the British one, that would follow a year or two later. And John Hughes took the project to the studio and was granted $30 million and a 100-day shooting schedule for the film, which raised a lot of eyebrows at the time. Hughes too would ink a deal with, this was described in Premiere magazine, with 20th Century Fox for $35 million over 7 movies, of which a pair of them were Home Alone sequels. But and it was described in terms of the ending of his Universal deal. In the midst of all of this, Hughes packed up and left the studio without telling a soul. There was set to be a spin-off movie from Home Alone called Bushwhacked, following the character of Marv as played by Daniel Stern, but in pre-production of that movie, and Stern would direct the film, the idea was revised, and it would be a separate character really, that Stern played in that, even though there are familiarities. And just to bring the story firmly up to date, with Home Alone now 30 years old and still as hugely popular, if not more popular than ever, Disney Plus has now decided what we need is another Home Alone film. So that's likely to be with us on its streaming service in 2021. That's one that Chris Columbus has come out against, really, while promoting his recent venture, The Christmas Chronicles 2, which has just been released at the time this has been recorded. But for the many sequels of Home Alone, and there have been lots, I mean, Home Alone The Holiday Heist, who remembers that? There is an argument, even though Columbus would suggest the second film, ultimately a remake as far as I can see, is better than the first, that few have captured the genie in a bottle of that first movie in lots of different senses. Which brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories. I mean, if I can ask just a couple of favours at this point. I am an independent podcast producer. I'm one bloke in a room. It's not even a very nice room, in truth. And I rely really on your word of mouth to get me this far. That's the only reason. I don't have a marketing budget or anything like that. If you like this podcast, therefore, please do subscribe to it at your podcast repository of choice. That really does help with all the posh algorithms and stuff that I don't understand. If too you can leave a review, ideally a hugely positive review, that is just gold dust for me. Likewise, if you can support the podcast, we're at patreon.com/Simon Brew. I'm putting up a few exclusive bits and bobs there, or we've got Film Stories magazines at store.filmstories.co.uk. Now, though, I'm going to move on to another Christmas film, and I'm going to move forward, well, to the year 2014. It's a less known Christmas film, but I think it's an equally charming one. Let me play you a clip. I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
Unconfirmed reports just in that thousands of children have awoken on Christmas morning to discover their stockings empty.
Are you the real Santa?
Oh, yeah.
Breaking news. A man claiming to be Santa was arrested last night trying to steal some reindeer.
Hey, Pop! What am I getting for Christmas? You have to let me out of here, or Christmas will be cancelled.
Santa's in prison.
What?
He crashed his sleigh, lost his reindeer, and if we don't help him, Christmas is off.
Well, that's it then, lads.
That then's a clip from the 2014 Christmas movie, British Christmas movie, Get Santa. Written and directed by Christopher Smith, starring Jim Broadbent as Santa Claus, a piece of casting so obvious you just wonder why everybody doesn't do it. Rafe Spall, Kit Connor, Ewan Bremner, Warwick Davis, Stephen Graham, Joanna Scanlon and Jodie Whittaker in the ensemble, as well as Nonso Nosey. The film, though, well, I mean, the standout name there, the one that perhaps raised eyebrows, particularly at the time, was Christopher Smith. With no disrespect to him, he knew going into this that he had a background in horror. In fact, most of the film world knew he had a background in horror. He directed films like Creep, Severance, Triangle and Black Death. These were the movies that he was most associated with. So it was something of a surprise when his name popped up as making a family Christmas movie. And as he explained in an interview with the Horror Channel, he said, I wrote Get Santa because I just had a son and was feeling like I wanted to do something that he could watch in the next 15 years. And he said at that point, I expected the film to take a year to come together, but it ended up taking 4 years. And what he conceived was a prison break movie with Santa Claus at the heart of it, with a few other very notable twists and turns that I don't particularly want to spoil for you, because I think this is a real surprise of a film that's, well, it's just really well worth seeking out and seeing it as cold as possible. Smith came to it then. He just made Black Death in 2010 and that had got decent reviews. Eddie Redmayne, Sean Bean starring in that one. But it hadn't really crossed over at the box office. It hadn't got, primarily because it wasn't given that many screens as part of its release. That was a huge part of it, I'd suggest. And so he was actively looking to do something more commercial. He wanted something that would be a bit more seen. And so he retired basically to the pub right near his house, and he came up with the idea of Santa crashing his sleigh and being sent to prison, and in the midst of that having a father and son story in a broken family as part and parcel of it. And he's talked about how this came together actually really quite quickly. He, coincidentally as well, the day after, he had a meeting with Ridley Scott's production company, Scott Free, which at that point was ramping up its slate of films that it was making from its UK arm. That Scott Free had been making the films of Ridley and the late Tony Scott, but it was actively looking for more British features. And so they discussed a few ideas, and Ridley Scott had been a fan of Black Death, and they talked about a possible science fiction project, and Scott asked if there were any other ideas that he had, and Smith said, yeah, I got this idea, this Christmas idea. Ridley Scott said, yeah, I like that, and Scott Free was on board pretty much that quickly, and the project began to get motoring. So I got in touch because there's not an awful lot of information out there about Get Santa. It's quite a hard one to research. So I went to Christopher Smith. I got in touch with him and I asked him a little bit more about what he was looking to do with this film and why this was a little bit different and how he came to it. And he told me that he came up with the idea, as he'd said before, not long after his first son, Harper, was born. And he said he wanted to make a comedy that Harper would be able to watch, one that was a little gritty nuttier around the edges than the over-sanitised fare we get spoon-fed at the moment. And Smith argues it's like filmmakers today are unwilling to venture into territory where a child might be forced to think about the things that many of them are dealing with on a daily basis. And one of the key touch points was E.T., the Spielberg movie. And Smith says, divorce, for example. E.T. begins with a family in turmoil because the father has moved to Mexico with his girlfriend. And Smith argues kids don't walk out of E.T. scarred as a result. And so what he wanted to do with his Christmas movie was he wanted to make a family film where, this is as spoilery as I'll go, and it is quite light in the context of it, even though it doesn't sound it, where at the end there's a family where a mum and dad are not together, but should not be considered necessarily a broken family. Smith also wanted to be clear that he wanted humour in it, and he wanted humour in his film that didn't just work for the kids, didn't just work for the parents, but could go across the two of them at the same time. He says humour that doesn't patronise the adults so they can enjoy the film on another level. And Smith says, in terms of his comedy touch points, he grew up on a diet of the sitcom Porridge. Now, Eliza Marshall at Scott Free Productions, she also loved it. She was keen to make a family film that her kids could see as well. And this was motoring in the right direction. So this must have been, 2010, early 2011. And so it all seemed pretty straightforward. In fact, the first initial official announcement I could find of the film was dated back to May 2011, when the Hollywood Reporter broke the news of the movie. It said Smith, whose resume includes Severance, Black Death and Triangle, is writing a second draft with a view to directing the as yet unnamed Christmas film for Scott Free UK. Now, at that point in its life, Scott Free UK had a first look deal with 20th Century Fox in the UK. Most of Ridley Scott's films of this era were going through 20th Century Fox, and the plan at this point was to get the film going in 2011, to get it up and running, to get it filming, with the proviso that it depends how it's received by potential partners. And those are the words of Liza Marshall. But she was optimistic it was going to happen at that point in 2011. Smith was working away on the script. He was doing a TV show called Labyrinth as well around the same time. But this was moving forward to the point where they thought, we can talk about casting of this. And so the name of Jim Broadbent bubbled pretty much to the top of the list for Santa Claus in the movie. He'd played the voice of Santa in Aardman's wonderful Arthur Christmas, which I talked about in a podcast last year. But they didn't see much evidence that he'd actually played the role in live action, and he was the first choice. He was sent the script. He loved the script. I mean, there's no drama to the way that Broadbent got involved with this one, but what there was an actor being sent a script saying, I'll do it, and then sticking with the project for the 3 years that it would now take to bring the whole thing together, because this didn't get up and running in 2011 for a couple of reasons, but Broadbent stuck with the film right throughout, much to the appreciation of Smith and the team. In fact, Broadbent had been in place for a little while by the time that Variety finally announced his casting in May 2013. And by this stage, 20th Century Fox, well, clearly it hadn't picked the project up. There's no active report of it turning it down, but the very fact that Scott Free had the deal with Fox in 2011 and the project would have been taken to the studio which wasn't making a lot of British films really, clearly just wasn't having it. As a consequence, it was putting together a matrix of companies who would finance the movie, because one of the things with Smith's script of this one is it did have a CG element to it, and it does have a CG element to the final film. That this isn't something that could have been done on one stage of a studio. That there are sleigh sequences, there are fantastical sequences that just require a little bit of budget that on some of it that will certainly eclipse some of the lower budget horror stuff that he'd done to that point. So it took a while to get the finance, Smith said, and he did have to get the script right. That was part and parcel of the process. So he kept working on that. But by May 2013, 20th Century Fox was out. Altitude was in. Now a distributor of some prominence in the UK, but then was handling the sales for the movie. And the film was in a place that it could be taken to the Cannes Film Festival in the spring of 2013, with Jim Broadbent's name attached, with Scott Free involved, and just the search was then on. Take it to Cannes, see if you can find some backers for the movie, and clearly they got some joy with this one. Ultimately, Warner Brothers in the UK only, actually, but Warner Brothers in the UK would come on board to distribute the movie, and Warner's was going through a little bit of a phase where it was backing UK productions. It would do The Girl with All the Gifts, which would come out a year or two later, which I will come to in a future podcast. But the problem was that because this was a Christmas movie, it was always working up against deadlines. And as Smith would say in a couple of interviews, he said it took a while to get the finance, that had to get the script right. The film just missed its deadline to get made first time around because there's only one period of the year it could get made and finished in time. And if it pushed past Christmas into January, they couldn't get the CG done in time before Christmas. So it obviously needed to shoot in winter just for some of the location-y bits and bobs, but also there was getting that digital work done. And so this would need to be up and running in some form, even in pre-production form, by November, December, for the film to be able to press ahead in time for the following Christmas. So ultimately, it did this time around get going at the second attempt when it got really close to happening. And by the end of 2013, it was coming together. So at this point, production support for the movie was announced in 2013, with the British Film Institute injecting £25,000 into development backing, which it had put in beforehand, and then a further £1 million in production support for the movie. This was also the same round of funding in which the BFI backed the terrific family movie Bill, which I've covered before as well, another British family movie. But ultimately, it was the coming together of pots of money from the BFI, from Screen Yorkshire, from Scott Free, from Altitude, and from Warner Brothers that got the budget for this film together. And there was never a fully announced budget for the movie, but it's fair to say it cost a few million to bring to the screen. Even though Jim Broadbent was in place, there was still some key casting that needed to be done, not least the fact that this film hinged on a young boy. That's the heart of the story, is a young boy and his reconciliation, or the relationship with his father, in the midst of a Christmas film. So I went on to, I don't know if you've seen the Wayback Machine, which is where you can find old websites that have now been long gone. There was a website called GetSantaCasting.com, which went live in 2013, was finally taken down in 2014, and that had the note on it: we're looking for a boy aged 8 to 10 years for a lead role in a new children's and family film produced by Scott Free Films. Auditions duly took place, and it was a young actor by the name of Kit Connor who prevailed. They trawled through, Christopher Smith has said, they trawled through lots of auditions for this one, and Connor was actually found 3 or 4 weeks from the end of that process. They kept looking and kept looking. The touch point for the performance and the actor really was going back to E.T. They wanted Elliot, that tone of Elliot in E.T. that Henry Thomas had brought to that movie. They needed someone young, but they also needed someone who could do several hours a day of filming, that they could hang part of this film on the shoulders of. And Kit Connor had some experience which really worked in his favour. He'd done a Sky One comedy show called Chickens, he'd done a BBC show called Rocket's Island, and he'd appeared in Doctor Who, an adventure in time and space docudrama as well. So with Connor in place, the last major piece of the casting jigsaw, notwithstanding the fact that Jodie Whittaker, giving another Doctor Who link in there, was going to join the project as well, albeit pre her Doctor Who days. Well, Rafe Spall, and interestingly, Christopher Smith has talked about how there was a list of people that he wasn't really drawn in the interviews that I've seen into, was he the first choice? But he was a name on the list, because he just said, well, Tom Cruise is always top of the list, isn't he? But Spall was just the kind of person really he was looking for. He was after someone who could balance the comedy and the drama of the movie. That again, it's quite a tonal balance that Get Santa goes for that a lot of times Christmas movies just go for one or the other, and this does walk a very, very fine line. Spall wasn't an instant sign-on. There's not evidence that he was top of the list, nor that he bit their hand off. He just said, I love Christmas. It's something I genuinely look forward to, but I wouldn't have done this if it didn't have an element of originality. And he credited the fact that he felt the script was written with intelligence and class and had really great people assembled to do it. And in fact, he would go on to tell New Shopper that I feel like it's warm and funny and sweet and knowing in parts and absolutely free of naffness, which can be associated with Christmas in other areas. And just to give some degree of contrast as to what Spall was up to at the time, he'd just come back from appearing on the New York stage, where he'd been appearing in a Harold Pinter play directed by the late Mike Nichols, and then he came back to do basically a small British Christmas movie. Filming then could finally get underway after pre-production work in January of 2014, and this shot in the UK as well. And that was really important, that it filmed across London and Yorkshire, that the Screen Yorkshire backing was crucial to the film, and as a consequence it did film in quite a few locations around the Yorkshire area. It filmed in Leeds, in Bradford, in Keighley, in Wetherby, also in Harewood House, and it appeared, at this point the Yorkshire Content Fund was relatively new. It was a £7.5 million fund to encourage filming in and around the Yorkshire area, and Get Santa was one of the first beneficiaries of that. The rest of the cast came into place as well. It was announced, the rest of the cast was actually announced in January 2014 as the movie started filming, and that's when we learned of the likes of Ewan Bremner, of Nonso Anonsi, of Warwick Davis, of Joanna Scanlon and Stephen Graham fleshing out the ensemble, as well as that stranger called Jodie Whittaker. Wonder what she would go on to do. It was it's quite a quick production in the scheme of things, and there aren't an awful lot of stories of the shoot itself, short of the fact that the excellent Sky One panel show, There's Something About Movies, I'm a real fan of this actually, if you've not checked it out. I think it's a very funny show. But Rafe Spall's just appeared on the Christmas episode of this, and a conversation started with the panellists as to injuries that they've picked up and accidents they've had on the sets of films that they've made. And Rafe Spall cited Get Santa, that he talked of picking up a minor injury where, let me put this in a family sensitive way, the antler of a reindeer protruded against his backside. Now fortunately no serious damage was done on this particular occasion. There was inevitably blue screen work that was done as well for the sleigh shots, and Spall was in the midst of doing Black Mirror as well at the time. So he gave an interview, I think it was to GQ, where he talked about the amount of blue screen stuff he happened to be doing at that point. One aside as well is Liza Marshall left Scott-Free Productions just towards the end of just coming up to the release of the film, to co-set up a film called Archery Pictures, which more recently has been doing the Sky drama Riviera. But as with the film wrapped, Warner Brothers started ramping up the publicity for this, and it was giving it an early December 2014 release date in the UK. Now, ultimately, it wouldn't release the film in America, and Smith had problems with his previous film not getting much of a release in the UK compared to the US. In this case, it was the other way round with Get Santa, that Get Santa would get a decent release in the UK. It went on to about 450 screens. But in the US, it was just seen as just too British. In interviews promoting the movie, he did jokingly say that he was looking at a possible sequel if this one worked. Something by the lines of along the lines of Ghetto Santa was the name that he was coming for, which makes sense if you see the movie. But the film never really got to that point where that was possible. And part of the problem, I think, was another film that was around at the end of 2014, another British festive film, was Nativity 3, Dude, Where's My Donkey? Now, I'm a huge fan of the first Nativity films. I have to confess, I am far less of a fan of the subsequent sequels, and I do not think Dude, Where's My Donkey is anywhere near the high point of that particular franchise. But, as I often cite, Edmund Blackadder always always said you can't argue with the box office, and Dude, Where's My Donkey was doing nearly £10 million worth of business and was the British Christmas film to see of that particular season. As a consequence, Get Santa got lost in the midst of all of that, really. And in fact, I confess, I did see this at the cinema, but I didn't see it until the following March, when it came round, oddly enough, as part of the kids' club sequences of showings that British multiplexes tend to have on Saturday and Sunday mornings. That in the middle of March, my local multiplex put on a screening of Get Santa at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and me and my kids went along to see it. I have to say, it charmed the absolute socks off me. Whilst I'm very strict on my rules of I don't want to punch down, and I don't really want to use this podcast to knock other films, I would just suggest gently that Get Santa is worth a lot more than Nativity 3, Dude, Where's My Donkey? And I say that with the Nativity films bringing a lot of work to the area in which I live, and I do appreciate they have a huge audience for them, and I respect that completely. My kids like them as well. I just think Get Santa is really special and didn't deserve to be overlooked. As it was overlooked, really. In the UK box office in 2014, it finished in 113th place. Its gross was just below 2 million. So it did what, a quarter of the business of the Nativity sequel. And that ended chances, really, that we would get to see any further adventures of Jim Broadbent's Santa Claus. And also, Christopher Smith had said at the time he was keen to do more family movies. And I really think he should as well, because I think this is, there's something, I mean this fully as a compliment, there's something really of the Amblin tone to quite a lot of Get Santa, I think, and it's not afraid of those harsh edges, and I do think it is one of the most overlooked Christmas films of the last 10-15 years and deserves another audience. It's why I've paired it up with Home Alone on this podcast. Two reasons. Number one, I think the story behind it actually happening is really quite interesting, that a meeting with Ridley Scott turned its fortunes, really, but also the fact that I just think it's one of those movies that deserves a lot more word of mouth. So please take this as my contribution to that. Which brings me to the end of our last regular episode of Film Stories of the year. You can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. The website filmstories.co.uk every weekday has features, reviews, news stories. We're really building up a clickbait-free website there. I'm very proud of that. You can buy our magazine, store.filmstories.co.uk, on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, on YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. What I do want to say, though, there's one more special episode that I've recorded that will be released over the Christmas period in 2020, but I do want to say, as this is the last episode I'm recording this year, first of all, bye-bye 2020, off you pop, don't let the door hit your backside on the way out. Secondly, thank you just for the incredible support that genuinely has kept the entire Film Stories project going through what has been a year. I think we can all agree it has been a year. But the most important thing is that you stay safe, you stay well, that you look after yourselves, and I hope that this period of the year does find some light and does find some smiles for you all. If you're on the wrong side of fortune at the moment, please take this as just a virtual hug in your direction, and I just do hope that the world finds you a little bit of goodness. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting me all this year. I'll be back with a new regular episode of Film Stories after a short winter break, so I'll be back in January 2021. Until then, you all take care of yourselves. Thank you. Bye-bye.